Hello, Dr. Bennett here. I am here now to talk a little about Rudolfo Anaya's Bless Me Ultima. There is a lot going on in this novel and film based on the novel. But one thing you may have noted as you're reading is that there are several binaries or dichotomies that Antonio is struggling with. Things that don't seem to be able to be reconciled, things that conflict with each other. In other words, for example, he can't understand how the Catholic religion and the precepts that he's been learning there can be true if also the story of the golden carp is true. Can those two things both be true? Can two things that seem to contradict each other both be true? Um, as we've discussed in some of the materials on the novel, um, some of these opposites or binaries or dichotomies, those are both words used to describe two things that seem like opposites of each other. Um, the list includes, for Antonio, his Mexican culture versus U.S. popular culture, innocence and experience, female and male. Those things seem to be defined as completely opposite of each other. If you're female, you can't be male. If you're male, you can't be female. Catholic versus pagan or a kind of more earth-based spiritual system. Farmers versus caballeros or the cowboys, the ranchers. The moon and the sea, and a desire to please others or a sense of being accepted by society versus independence or autonomy, being yourself. So those are listed in a handout that's available to you, but so you can go back and review those. But those things are making life difficult for Tony as he tries to grow up and do the responsible things. Um, During the coming of age phase, people go through this up until the time when they begin to transition into adulthood. A lot of times, children simply accept what people tell them. If their parents tell them that the Catholic Church is the truth, then they simply believe that. And it can be difficult even for children if somebody questions those things, but they don't really have necessarily the capacity to kind of hash through the various aspects of those things that seem to be contradicting each other. So sometimes they deal with them and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they just go out and play and don't worry about it, right? But when people come into their adolescence, they begin to grapple with those things that don't seem to make sense, and their brain is trying to make sense out of them, right? So, what is this novel doing with those binaries? I would like to suggest that through some key strategies, Anaya is trying to show how Tony learns to hold seemingly contradictory things in the same space, to kind of be whole, even though there are things in his head and in his life that don't seem to belong together. Um, and I see passages even fairly early in the novel that address this difficulty that Tony's going through. Um, Toward the end of chapter 11, or once, Antonio has one of his dreams, and those are indicated by italics, right? Suddenly the font changes into italics. And in that dream, he's struggling with having learned about the story of the golden carp and trying to understand how he can bring the things together, including the carp and his Catholicism and his mother's desire for him to become a priest, as well as the conflict between the Maras and the Lunas. He's always trying to decide whether he's really more of a Maras or a Luna, and he feels terribly torn. because his parents kind of put him in a difficult position with their bickering, right? Um, but in the middle of his dream, he looks up and sees Ultima. Cease, she cried to the raging powers, and the power from the heavens and the power from the earth obeyed her. The storm abated. Stand, Antonio, she commanded, and I stood. You both know, she spoke to my father and my mother, that the sweet water of the moon, which falls as rain, is the same water that gathers into rivers and flows to fill the seas. So water is the thing that connects the two. The Maras, the sea family, and the Lunas, which are the moon family, right? The farmers. Um, and she says to Antonio, you have been seeing only parts and not looking beyond into the great cycle that binds us all. So he's struggling to understand through the whole story, but he, only toward the end, comes to some sort of position that helps him manage all of it, right? If you recall, he has a conversation with his father in the truck where he he asks his dad, is it possible to make a new religion? Um, and he feels somewhat blasphemous thinking about this earlier. So is it a betrayal of God if he thinks about um, the possibility of the golden carp also being a god? And if you think about Antonio's background, the indigenous people that he comes from versus the European side of his family, um, does he have to deny the indigenous mythologies that come down through the Aztecs in order to be a good Catholic, right, or a good American? He's got these kind of built-in conflicts in his life because of his mixed ethnic heritage or cultural heritage. But when he has this conversation with his father says, I don't see why you couldn't make a new religion. And he talks about how understanding comes over time. That Antonio can't expect to resolve all the conflicts at once, especially when he's only about 8 years old, right, at this point. Um, but I want to suggest that that theme is developed all the way through the novel, and that Anaya does a good job of using narrative strategies to manage it. One of them is the first person point of view with Antonio as a child, because he can sort of believe multiple things at once that maybe don't seem to make sense together because he's still a child. And when we're children, we do that, right? We believe in sometimes fairies and things that later we stop believing in as we try to make sense out of the world. So from the child's perspective, we can sort of go through this with him and remember those experiences that we had where we were trying to pull those things together or knock out the ones that just we had to reject. Another thing he uses is magic realism, which is this kind of very realistic world that he creates in his fictional location in New Mexico. But in the middle of that very realistic world where people are poor, where they're out tending the animals, you've got a very realistic descriptions of the landscape and their daily activities. In the middle of all that, you have these kind of magical things happen, and people don't seem surprised by them, right? They're just part of their everyday life. This is an old, it was something that was developed in the early part of the 20th century. One of the first people to use what we now call magic realism was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was South American. And it worked so well for a lot of cultural perspectives that people picked it up and really started to use it. So you can see quite a few examples of it now and today in literature. And then the other thing that he uses, the other strategy that I think works well, is the multicultural perspective, where you're bringing together things that don't always fit, like two languages. Antonio sort of is moving back and forth between two languages. that don't seem to be very compatible with each other, especially culturally. So those things, those strategies, first person point of view, magic realism, and multicultural perspective really help him develop this theme of bringing opposites into the same space and allowing them to exist together. And important symbols that help us with that in the story are Ultima's owl, who is kind of a bridge between um, the physical and, the human world and the natural world, but also is kind of a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. The owl embodies Ultima's spirit in some way. The Virgin de Guadalupe, which you hopefully have now explored that story, where you have a Catholic symbol, Mother Mary, who's also embodying a, a goddess of the Aztecs, Tonantzin, who was a mother figure in the Aztec god and goddess world, and really helped to bring together the indigenous culture with the Spanish culture when they first moved in and imposed Catholicism on the people of that region. So Virgin de Guadalupe is very dear to a lot of people in that area, and honestly here in Gainesville. Um, the golden carp, which brings together in some ways the creation story and the redemption story of the Aztecs and that of Christianity. And then water is an incredible symbol in this book because it is protean, right? It is changeable. It can hold all the contradictions, right? Water is constantly moving and changing and shifting shapes. So in a world where things seem very fixed, and it seems like how could you possibly believe in Catholicism if you also believe in the golden carp? Water is kind of a medium in which all things can exist together. It's a whole, it's like a pond, which is one whole thing, and yet nothing in it is fixed, right? Everything is moving, everything is sort of shifting around. So there are lots of good water images in the story, and I would love to explore that further, but I'm going to stop now. All right, thank you.